The heavy, double doors of the Park Group's executive boardroom swung open, not with a violence this time, but with a rhythmic, high-status grace that commanded the silence of every suit-clad shark in the room. Kennedy James stepped through the threshold, her deep warm brown skin glowing under the cinematic lighting of the skyscraper. She was no longer the girl in the damp, heavy gray hoodie. She wore a tailored obsidian dress that clung to her growing silhouette, a signature eternity necklace catching the light at her throat. Her long, natural curls were styled with polished precision, framing a face that no longer screamed with panic, but radiated a calm, CEO control that mirrored the man walking beside her. Taeho stood at her side, his dark hair swept back and his sharp jawline set in a look of profound, obsessive pride. He didn't lead her, he walked with her, his hand firmly cupping the small of her back as they reached the head of the table. The board members, including Park Eun-ju and a pale, trembling Park Ha-rin, stood in a wave of forced respect, their eyes heavy with the realization that the regular working girl had successfully navigated the coup. "The transition is complete," Taeho announced, his voice a controlled rumble that echoed through the high-status chamber. "Kennedy isn't just my fiancée. She is the iron-willed partner who will help me lead the Park Group into a new era. From this moment on, you will call her Madam." Kennedy scanned the room with focused, heavy eyes. She looked at Eun-ju, who had once called her a price-tagged thing, and at Ha-rin, who had tried to throw her into the trash. Kennedy didn't offer a smile. She offered the predatory stillness of a woman who had survived the underground war and come out as the victor. "I spent years serving people who didn't see me," Kennedy said, her voice smooth and devoid of the vulnerability that had once defined her. "I know how to spot a rat when it's cornered, and I know exactly how to clean house. If you're worried about your future in this company, start acting like real partners instead of predators." The room was silent as she took her seat at the right hand of the dragon. Taeho leaned in, his lips brushing her ear in a pained, serious whisper that only she could hear. "I told you that night was a miracle, Kennedy. You saved me from becoming a Greek statue, and now you're the one holding the crown." As the meeting began, Kennedy felt the kick of the airs beneath her heart, the next generation of the Park legacy. She wasn't running anymore. She had faced every storm, survived every betrayal, and turned her gilded cage into a throne. Beside her, Taeho's hand found hers under the table, his grip a vow of possession and protective love. The waitress from the slums was gone, replaced by a queen who finally owned her power, ready to rule the empire she had once tried to flee. "Would you like me to create a cinematic image prompt for the Long Live the Queen boardroom scene?" The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open with a violence that silenced the morning rush, and Kennedy felt the air leave her lungs. A phalanx of men in tailored black suits filed in, their predatory focus clearing a path for a figure who radiated high status, expensive energy. Park Taeho stepped into the center of the room, his dark hair swept back and his expression a mask of calm, emotionally restrained fury. He didn't look like the man Kennedy had fanned one notes for just hours ago. He looked like a god of the underworld who had come to collect a debt. "The Park Group has finalized the acquisition of this block," one of the assistants announced, but Taeho's eyes were already locked on Kennedy, heavy and focused. Kennedy ducked her head, her long, natural curls shielding her face as she fumbled with a tray, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was a top performer, a regular working girl who had never missed a shift, but now every instinct screamed at her to run. Taeho's gaze swept over the staff like a cold CEO control aura. He didn't smile as he leaned against the counter, his sharp jawline set in a mask of possession and dominance. "The financial reports for this establishment are a disaster," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence. "We are cleaning house. I'm cutting anyone with poor performance, and I'm starting with a mandatory, company-wide medical exam. Mandatory for all staff, effective immediately." Kennedy's hand flew to the pocket of her hoodie, where the digital pregnancy test still felt like a ticking bomb. "A checkup now? New boss, new rules." The room blurred as Taeho continued, his eyes never leaving the area where Kennedy stood trembling. Make sure the female staff are seen by doctors specializing in gynecology, he added. His tone brook no argument. Physical exams keep the staff clean and protect the reputation of the park group from inappropriate people. Is this a personal issue, sir? A manager dared to whisper, but Taeho simply adjusted his fitted black coat, the rain from outside still glistening on his shoulders like diamonds. Just do it. Panic, dread, and a sense of being trapped flooded Kennedy as she watched the medical teams begin to set up in the back offices. She was a top performer, but that wouldn't save her from a gynecological report that would link her directly to the man standing 10 feet away. She looked for an exit, any way to slip through the security staff that now guarded every door, but Taeho's predatory eyes remained fixed on her, signaling that he was obsessed and not forgiving her for trying to hide. The trap was set, and as the first name was called, Kennedy realized that the secret she carried was the only thing Taeho wanted, and the one thing he would never let her keep for herself. The sterile white walls of the makeshift medical suite felt like the interior of a coffin as Kennedy sat on the edge of the examination table, her damp hoodie pulled tight around her shivering frame. Outside the door, she could hear the muffled, authoritative tones of Taeho's voice, the sound of a man who owned the building, the air, and every secret kept within it. Her eyes were wide, glossy, and intense, screaming with a mix of shock and dread as the female doctor reviewed the ultrasound monitor in a heavy, pregnant silence. "The results are undeniable, Miss James," the doctor said, her voice clinical and devoid of the miracle Kennedy was supposed to feel. "You are pregnant. The fetal heartbeat is strong." Kennedy's mouth opened mid-gasp, her brows raised in a perfect expression of vulnerability and panic. She looked at the monitor, at the tiny flicker of life that had been created during a night she thought she'd paid for with $50 and a quick exit. "Does this report go to management?" she whispered, her voice cracking with the intensity of her fear. "Does Park Taeho see this?" The doctor began to type into the tablet, her face as emotionally restrained as the CEO waiting in the hall. "This is a company-mandated exam. All records are uploaded to the Park Group's HR portal for personnel optimization. Wait," Kennedy breathed, reaching into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against the last of her savings, a thick envelope of one she had been hoarding for a plane ticket back to America. She thrust the envelope onto the medical tray, her expression a mix of desperation and a regular working girl trying to survive. "Please, don't upload it. Just mark me as unfit for duty or say it's a monthly curse. Just keep those 2 red lines off my file." The doctor looked at the money, then back at Kennedy's dewy, panicked face. "You're asking me to commit fraud against a man who has CEO control over this entire district? Do you have any idea who Park Taeho is?" "I know he's a man who puts price tags on people," Kennedy retorted, her fear momentarily flashing into a sharp, defiant intensity. "I'm just a waitress to him. If he sees this, I'm done. He's already cutting anyone he thinks is a liability." The doctor sighed, pushing the money back toward Kennedy with a pained, serious look. "I'm sorry, Miss James. In the Park family, secrets don't stay buried long. He's already requested the gynecological summaries personally." A cold chill washed over Kennedy as the doctor hit the submit button. The digital test was no longer just a prop in her hand. It was now a permanent mark in the Park Group's database. She felt trapped, caught between surrender and the need to run, unaware that Taeho was already outside, his focused, predatory eyes staring at the notification on his own screen. Kennedy had tried to buy her freedom with scraps, but Taeho was already moving to ensure that no hospital or borders would ever assist her in taking his air away. "Would you like me to write Chapter 3, where Taeho intercepts Kennedy's flight and places her in his gilded cage?" The neon lights of Incheon International Airport blurred into streaks of cold blue as Kennedy wove through the crowd, her simple gray hoodie pulled low over her wet, messy curls. Every muscle in her body screamed with the urge to disappear before the personnel optimization report reached the top floor of the Park Group. She clutched her passport and a one-way ticket to New York, her eyes wide and glossy with a mix of shock and dread. She was a regular working girl who had finally run out of places to hide, and the terminal gates felt like the only exit left in a world that was rapidly shrinking. She reached the boarding bridge, her breath hitching as she handed her pass to the attendant. But before the gate could open, a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder with the force of a predator catching its prey. The air around her turned frigid as the crowd parted, revealing Park Tae-ho. He stood in his fitted black coat, his dark hair swept back and his expression a mask of possession and restrained fury. The rain from the tarmac still glistened on his shoulders, making his sharp jawline look even more dangerous in the cinematic lighting of the terminal. "The flight is grounded," Kennedy, Tae-ho said, his voice a low, controlled rumble that signaled he was not forgiving her for running. He didn't look at the ticket, he looked only at her, his eyes focused and predatory. He cupped her jaw firmly, pulling her close until she was frozen between fear and surrender. "Did you really think you could take my heir to another continent and raise them in a studio apartment? You're not escaping me." "I'm just a waitress to you," Kennedy gasped, her lips slightly parted as she felt the weight of his CEO control, crushing her plans. "You can't keep me here against my will." "I can and I will," he countered, his hand firmly cupping her cheek as he signaled to the men in black suits behind him. "You are no longer an employee. You are a Park." Tae-ho didn't take her to a police station or a hotel. He took her to a sprawling, isolated estate, a gilded cage where the windows were reinforced and the security was around the clock. As she was ushered into a bedroom that cost more than her entire life, Tae-ho made a single, cold phone call that shattered her last hope for a way out. "Alert every hospital in the city," he commanded, his eyes heavy with an intense obsession. "No procedure goes through under the name Kennedy James. No one touches my children." Kennedy collapsed onto the silk sheets, her deep warm brown skin pale with the realization of her new reality. She was trapped in a world of high-status wealth and mafia bloodlines, and the man who had stolen her breath with a kiss was now the man who owned her future. She looked at the door, but there was no handle on the inside, only the silent, predatory shadow of Tae-ho watching her through the glass, ensuring that no harm and no escape would ever come to her again. "Would you like me to write Chapter 4, where Park Tae-ho's mother attempts to humiliate Kennedy at a formal family dinner?" The dining hall of the Park estate felt like a cathedral of ice, where every clink of silver against fine bone china echoed with a cold, predatory intent. Kennedy sat at the long mahogany table, her deep warm brown skin a stark contrast to the cream-colored silk dress Tae-ho had forced her to wear. She felt exposed, her wide, glossy eyes darting toward the head of the table where Park Eun-ju sat. Tae-ho's mother was a vision of sharp, aristocratic cruelty, her every movement radiating a CEO control that made the gilded cage feel even smaller. "I've been looking at the financial reports for the restaurant Tae-ho just acquired," Eun-ju began, her voice a low, cultured venom that cut through the silence. She didn't look at her son, she kept her focused, heavy gaze on Kennedy, who was struggling to maintain her composure. "It's fascinating how some women think a single night of poor performance can be leveraged into a life of luxury. Since when did foreign waitresses become things that people just put price tags on?" Kennedy's mouth opened slightly, a mid-gasp of shock and vulnerability that she couldn't quite hide. She looked to Tae-ho, but he remained calm and emotionally restrained, his dark, styled hair catching the light as he cut into a steak with clinical precision. He didn't intervene, he simply watched, his predatory eyes signaling that this was a test he expected her to pass. "I am not a thing with a price tag," Kennedy whispered, her voice trembling but her brows raised in a flash of defiance. "I worked every shift, gave my heart to my job, and I never asked to be brought here. And yet, here you are, pregnant with a child that will never truly be yours," Eun-ju countered, her expression one of pained, serious disdain. She leaned forward, the lighting making her sharp features pop with cinematic intensity. "You're an inappropriate person for this family's reputation. My son may be obsessed with his legacy, but don't think for a second that your common blood makes you a Park. You're just a temporary vessel, a price-tagged thing he bought to secure his swimmers." The humiliation burned hotter than the dewy rain that had clung to her skin only hours before. Kennedy felt the regular working girl, inside her screaming to run, to flee back to the slums where she was at least treated like a human being. But as Taeho finally reached over and firmly cupped her jaw, pulling her gaze toward his own focused, heavy stare, she realized there was no escape from this high-status nightmare. "Enough, mother," Taeho said, his tone a controlled rumble of restrained fury. "Kennedy is carrying the heirs to the Park family. If you want to talk about price tags, remember that I own everything in the city, including the hospital where you'll be staying if you continue to disrespect my person." Kennedy sat frozen, caught between fear and a sudden, dark surrender. She was trapped in a war of bloodlines and bank accounts, and she was starting to realize that to survive the Park family, she would have to stop being a victim and start learning how to set her own price. Would you like me to write Chapter 5, where Taeho's sister, Harin, frames Kennedy for a security breach? The silence of the Park estate was shattered by the rhythmic, mechanical wail of a security alarm. Kennedy sat upright in the center of her sprawling bed, her eyes wide and glossy with a sudden, sharp dread. The cinematic lighting of the hallway strobed red, casting long, predatory shadows against the walls of her gilded cage. Before she could reach for her simple gray hoodie, the door was kicked open by a team of security men, followed closely by Park Harin. Taeho's sister stood with an expression of cold, brooding triumph, her dark hair perfectly styled even in the middle of the night. She held a high-status encrypted tablet, the kind used only by the Park Group's inner circle to access syndicate secrets. "I found this in the vent behind your bed, Kennedy," Harin stated, her voice a low, clinical venom that signaled she was not forgiving Kennedy for stealing her brother's attention. "You've been leaking the financial reports of the Park Group to the rival gangs. You're not just a low-life waitress, you're a spy." "I didn't do that. I don't even know how to use that thing," Kennedy gasped, her mouth open mid-gasp as she felt the weight of the adopted fraud's betrayal. She looked at the tablet, her brows raised in a perfect mix of shock and confusion. "I've never even left this room without a guard. The logs don't lie." "Your fingerprint is all over the screen," Harin countered, her gaze heavy and focused as she signaled the guards to seize Kennedy. "My brother may be obsessed with your pregnancy, but he won't tolerate a ticking time bomb in his own house. Rules are rules. Pregnant or not, spies are thrown out into the trash where they belong." Kennedy was dragged from the room, her deep warm brown skin pale as she was hauled through the marble corridors. They didn't wait for Taeho to return from his late-night meeting. Harin personally escorted her to the main gate, where a freezing soul rain was beginning to lash against the pavement. "Wait for my brother to explain?" "Dream on," Harin hissed, her hand firmly cupping Kennedy's jaw one last time just to shove her toward the exit. "You were just a temporary plaything, Kennedy. A regular working girl who got too greedy." The gates groaned shut and Kennedy was cast out into the dark. She stood on the wet asphalt, her simple black top clinging to her skin as the rain made her long, natural curls messy and heavy. She clutched her belly, the vulnerability of her situation hitting her like a physical blow. She was back in the rain, stripped of the Park name, and framed for a crime that would make her a target for every syndicate in the city. As she looked back at the cold, high-status silhouette of the estate, she realized that Harin hadn't just framed her for a security breach, she had marked her for death. "Would you like me to write Chapter 6, where Kennedy saves Taeho's mother from a scandal, earning a secret ally?" The freezing rain had barely begun to soak through Kennedy's hoodie when the roar of a high-performance engine cut through the downpour, followed by the screech of tires against the wet asphalt. Taeho's black SUV skidded to a halt at the estate gates, and he stepped out into the storm, his dark, styled hair immediately slicked back by the rain as his eyes found Kennedy shivering on the pavement. His expression was a mask of restrained fury, a cold CEO control that signaled someone was about to pay 1,000-fold for this transgression. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that made the guards at the gate post drop their gazes in terror. He didn't wait for an answer as he wrapped his fitted black coat around Kennedy's trembling shoulders, his hand firmly cupping her jaw to tilt her face toward his focused, predatory gaze. "Harin said. She said I was a spy," Kennedy gasped, her lips slightly parted as she clutched the lapels of his coat, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and relief. Taeho didn't look toward the estate. He looked only at her, his obsession burning through the cinematic shadows of the night. Kennedy is my person. Bullying my person in my own home is an act of war. He led her back through the gates, his presence radiating a high-status dominance that silenced the entire household. In the grand foyer, he found the security team and the maids who had stood by and watched Harin drag her out. Taeho didn't raise his voice, which made his words feel even more lethal. Abuse of power, harassment, and gross negligence, he stated, his sharp jawline set in stone as he addressed the cowering staff. You're all fired. Effective immediately. Clear out your things and be gone before the sun rises. But sir, one of the senior guards stammered, she is the future mother of the park heirs, Taeho interrupted, his eyes heavy with possession. And as of this moment, she is my official fiancé. Anyone who treats her as anything less than the mistress of this house will find themselves answering to the mafia side of my business, not the corporate one. Kennedy felt a surge of pure shock, her brows raised in disbelief as the regular working girl she used to be vanished under the weight of his declaration. She looked at the staff, the same people who had mocked her as a price-tagged thing only hours ago, now bowing their heads in silence. Taeho leaned down, his lips brushing against her temple as he pulled her closer against his chest. I told you once, Kennedy, he whispered, his tone a pained, serious vow. I don't care about money or social status. You fought to protect our baby in that rain, and I will burn this city to the ground before I let anyone walk over you again. As he began to lead her up the stairs toward the master suite, Kennedy realized the gilded cage had transformed. She was no longer a prisoner, she was being forged into a weapon, shielded by the dragon's protection as she prepared to face the Park family on her own terms. Would you like me to write Chapter 7, where a rival syndicate targets Kennedy and she must use her street smarts to survive? The high-status safety of the Park estate shattered the moment Kennedy's armored car was forced off the road in the neon-lit shadows of the Gangnam district. A black sedan slammed into their flank, the screech of metal against metal echoing like a death knell. Kennedy's wide, glossy eyes reflected the strobe of streetlights as she clutched her belly, her mouth opening in a mid-gasp of pure shock. Before her guards could react, a hail of gunfire erupted, the cinematic lighting of the city catching the shattered glass as it rained down like diamonds. The rivals, her driver hissed, but his voice was cut short as a second vehicle pinned them in. Kennedy felt the dewy sweat of panic on her skin, but beneath the fear, the regular working girl, who had survived the rougher corners of Seoul, began to take over. She knew this neighborhood. She had walked these back alleys as a waitress long before she was a mafia fiancé. As the rival gunmen approached with focused, predatory eyes, Kennedy didn't wait to be rescued. She kicked the damaged door open, her simple gray hoodie blending into the cool shadows as she rolled out of the vehicle. She didn't run toward the main road where they expected her. She dove into a narrow service alley behind a luxury hotel, her long, natural curls messy and wet as she navigated the damp, heavy darkness. She heard their footsteps, heavy, masculine, and full of possession and restrained fury. They weren't here to kill her. They were here to steal the Park heirs. Using the street smarts she'd honed over years of avoiding predatory customers, Kennedy climbed a stack of shipping crates and slipped into the steam-filled ventilation shaft of a nearby kitchen. She stayed silent, her breath hitching as the gunman passed just inches below her hiding spot. Where is she? One growled, his voice a low, clinical venom. The CEO will burn this district if we don't find her. Kennedy waited until their shadows faded before dropping back to the pavement. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the layout of the city and the urgency of a mother's protective instinct. She navigated the maze of trash bins and steam pipes, emerging blocks away at a crowded 24-hour market where she could disappear into the crowd of common workers. By the time Taeho arrived at the scene of the ambush, his expression a mask of pain, serious obsession, Kennedy was already calling him from a burner phone she'd bartered for with her gold watch. She was shaken, her deep warm brown skin pale and dewy with rain, but she was standing her ground. She had survived the underground war not as a helpless victim, but as a woman who knew exactly how to navigate the shadows. Taeho's voice came through the line, a controlled rumble of relief and pride. "Stay where you are, Kennedy. I'm coming for you, and tonight, the people who touched my person will learn why they should have stayed in the dark." Would you like me to write Chapter 8, where Taeho catches Kennedy running one last time and finally confesses his heart? The neon signs of the market flickered and buzzed, casting distorted, predatory shadows across the slick pavement as the storm finally broke into a torrential downpour. Kennedy pushed through the crowd of late-night shoppers, her simple gray hoodie heavy and damp against her skin. Her eyes were wide, glossy, and intense, darting toward the street corner where she had intended to disappear into the anonymity of the city one last time. Even after surviving the ambush, the regular working girl, inside her, whispered that she would never truly be safe in a gilded cage built on mafia blood. She turned into a quiet side street, her long, natural curls wet and clinging to her face, but the roar of a high-performance engine cut through the rain. Tires screeched against the asphalt, and a black luxury sedan skidded to a halt, blocking her path with the cold, high-status dominance of a predator. Park Taeho stepped out into the deluge, his dark, styled hair slicked back and his fitted black coat whipping in the wind. His expression was a mask of pain, serious obsession, his sharp jawline set in a look of possession and restrained fury. "Stop running, Kennedy," he commanded, his voice a low, controlled rumble that signaled he was finished with this game. "I can't live like this, Taeho," Kennedy cried out, her mouth open mid-gasp as she backed away, her brows raised in a perfect mix of shock and dread. "Your world, it's all violence and price tags. I'm just a waitress you caught in a trap." In 2 strides, Taeho was on her. He didn't let her retreat. He reached out and gripped her shoulders, his presence radiating an intense CEO control that anchored her to the spot. With a sudden, decisive movement, he pinned her against the side of the car, the metal cold against her back, while his body provided a wall of masculine heat. He was too close, too dominant, and Kennedy felt her knees go weak under the weight of his focused, heavy gaze. "You think this is about a price tag?" he hissed, his hand firmly cupping her jaw to tilt her dewy face toward his. "You think I burned down a rival syndicate tonight just for an heir? Look at me, Kennedy." His eyes were no longer just predatory. They were filled with a raw, intense obsession that stole her breath. "I spent my life as a Greek statue, cold and untouchable," he whispered, his lips hovering just inches from hers. "Then you walked in and left $50 on my nightstand like I was nothing. You're the only person who doesn't fear me, and you're the only person I can't live without." Before she could speak, he leaned in and stole her breath with a kiss that was part possession, part surrender, and entirely undeniable. It was the Christmas miracle Kennedy never expected, a moment of pure cinematic intensity where the world of the Park family and the world of a simple waitress finally collided. Kennedy's lips parted in shock, her fingers tangling in the damp fabric of his coat as she realized she was no longer frozen by fear, but by the overwhelming truth that she had finally been caught by the only man she wanted to stay for. Would you like me to write the final chapter, Chapter 9, where Kennedy takes her place as the iron-willed matriarch of the Park Empire? The heavy, double doors of the Park Group's executive boardroom swung open, not with a violence this time, but with a rhythmic, high-status grace that commanded the silence of every suit-clad shark in the room. Kennedy James stepped through the threshold, her deep warm brown skin glowing under the cinematic lighting of the skyscraper. She was no longer the girl in the damp, heavy gray hoodie. She wore a tailored obsidian dress that clung to her growing silhouette, a signature eternity necklace catching the light at her throat. Her long, natural curls were styled with polished precision, framing a face that no longer screamed with panic, but radiated a calm, CEO control that mirrored the man walking beside her. Taeho stood at her side, his dark hair swept back and his sharp jawline set in a look of profound, obsessive pride. He didn't lead her, he walked with her, his hand firmly cupping the small of her back as they reached the head of the table. The board members, including Park Eun-ju and Apale, trembling Park Ha-rin, stood in a wave of forced respect, their eyes heavy with the realization that the regular working girl had successfully navigated the coup. The transition is complete, Tae-ho announced, his voice a controlled rumble that echoed through the high-status chamber. Kennedy isn't just my fiancée. She is the iron-willed partner who will help me lead the Park Group into a new era. From this moment on, you will call her Madam. Kennedy scanned the room with focused, heavy eyes. She looked at Eun-ju, who had once called her a price-tagged thing, and at Ha-rin, who had tried to throw her into the trash. Kennedy didn't offer a smile. She offered the predatory stillness of a woman who had survived the underground war and come out as the victor. I spent years serving people who didn't see me, Kennedy said, her voice smooth and devoid of the vulnerability that had once defined her. I know how to spot a rat when it's cornered, and I know exactly how to clean house. If you're worried about your future in this company, start acting like real partners instead of predators. The room was silent as she took her seat at the right hand of the dragon. Tae-ho leaned in, his lips brushing her ear in a pained, serious whisper that only she could hear. I told you that night was a miracle, Kennedy. You saved me from becoming a Greek statue, and now you're the one holding the crown. As the meeting began, Kennedy felt the kick of the airs beneath her heart, the next generation of the Park legacy. She wasn't running anymore. She had faced every storm, survived every betrayal, and turned her gilded cage into a throne. Beside her, Tae-ho's hand found hers under the table, his grip a vow of possession and protective love. The waitress from the slums was gone, replaced by a queen who finally owned her power, ready to rule the empire she had once tried to flee.